Chapter 25. The Real Push. Because I almost always wrestled second from last each night, finding a decent dinner was usually a hit-and-miss affair. It was Denny's, if I was lucky. After eating, and usually drinking, when the wrestlers got to their rooms, they'd still be supercharged on adrenaline, almost euphoric. It was impossible to fall asleep in time to be able to get up to make that early morning flight unless you took something to help. Then in the morning a lot of wrestlers would take something to help them wake up, like ephedrine, commonly known as trucker pills. With a couple of those in them, they could rush off to the gym as soon as they got off the plane in the next town. The days of wrestlers chopping lines of coke were mostly gone, replaced by amino acid pills and protein shakes, but there were still syringes loaded with steroids. The WWF was a muscleman meat factory. Then there were the pain pills that were popped like candy. All too often I can remember washing them down with coffee. Looking at Dynamite that day in his car made me realize that if I was falling apart, I wanted to know it. So I stopped taking the pain pills. On October 9th at TV's in Springfield, Illinois, Jim and I were finishing up a photo shoot when word came that Vince wanted to see us. We headed over to his backstage office, where there had been a revolving door of wrestlers coming in and out all morning. Vince opened his door and said, "I need to talk to both of you. Brett, I'll see you first. Jim, you wait outside." The first thing he said was, "Brett, we're going with you in singles." With a tag belt I thought I had a rock-solid position, but now everything was uncertain again. "This is going to be the big push," he said. "The real push, the one I've always promised you. The one you've been waiting for. The one you deserve. You'll be involved in all the major angles with all the top men, and it's not going to be like all those other times where we didn't come through. The plans I have for you are bigger than anything you've ever imagined." We studied each other. I asked, "What about Jim?" Vince's face grew serious. "I'll be letting 17 guys go today and Jim's not one of them. I'm thinking I'll try him at the announcing table for a while, putting him on salary with a pension and full company benefits. I can't let him go, he owes me a lot of money from all his legal fees." Vince's plan was that the foundation would drop the belts to the Rockers at the next TVs, at which they'd also be taping Saturday night's main event. When I left the room, Jim looked like a prisoner preparing to see the warden. Afterwards, he did his best to appear upbeat, but it was easy to see he was devastated. At least he had his ongoing countersuit against US Air and the hope of an eventual settlement. One-man gang Haku, Honky Tonk, Tito Santana, Greg Valentine and Bill Eadie were let go. And then there was Bad News, who, upon being given notice, not surprisingly grabbed Vince by the scruff of the neck and told him he was lucky that he didn't kill him for all the lies he'd told him. Then Rick Rude quit after finding out how much Warrior was paid for SummerSlam compared to what he got for carrying their entire match. It was going to be a whole new team, but it looked like I had a starting position. On October 29th, I drove to Fort Wayne, Indiana, with Kerry Von Erich, another of Fritz Von Erich's sons. Kerry was a big, handsome, well-built kid with a kind streak a mile wide who wouldn't think twice about giving you the shirt off his back. I loved how genuine and considerate he was, especially to the fans. To that point, the highlight of his career was beating Ric Flair for the NWA World Heavyweight title in May 1984 in front of more than 40,000 of his fellow Texans at a tribute card to honor the memory of his oldest brother, David. Unfortunately, like his brothers, Kerry had a history of drug problems and was often mistaken for adult by wrestlers who didn't know him well. That night I mentioned to Kerry that I'd decided to bring my brother Bruce down for Survivor Series. I'd become sympathetic to Bruce's struggle to support his family and how desperately he still wanted to be part of the business. Since Vince had raved about his letter, I took it upon myself to play matchmaker in hopes that Vince would meet with Bruce and maybe give him a job. In many ways Bruce had a great mind for the business, if only he could rein himself in from doing the really stupid things. Kerry and I talked on and on about our brothers and good times that we'd both had as famous families in such a strange business. Just as we neared Fort Wayne, Kerry confided that he'd made up his mind to join his brothers in heaven. He was only waiting for God to tell him when. I said, "Kerry, your children will always need you, even more than your brothers do. You have to think of your children." He allowed me to think I'd made him change his mind, but I feared it was only lip service. For our SNME match the next night, the Hart Foundation marched out wearing pink and black Civil War jackets to drop the belts to the Rockers. Jim and I were somber, thinking this might be our last ever match together. Pat wanted it to be best of 3 falls, so the 4 of us had spent the afternoon creating a match that had a mixture of great moves and cute little rehearsed spots. We all dug deep to find ways to top our last Saturday night's main event match, which many consider to be one of the best tag matches ever. What started out as a terrific match snowballed into a colossal clusterfuck after Jim accidentally broke the top rope. The match was taped and could easily be edited, but the ref, Freddie Sparta, couldn't figure out that he needed to temporarily stop the bout and fix the rope, even though I explained it to him. Both teams needed the rope to do our best spots, and without it the whole match turned into an embarrassing night of miscues until finally the Rockers beat us. I was furious at Freddie. I hoped that before the match aired in a couple of weeks we could somehow do it over. I wanted it to be a great moment for both the Rockers, Sean in particular, whom I respected and who had admitted to being a bit of a Hitman fan. 5 days later in Milwaukee, Jim lugged his bags into the dressing room with a huge grin on his face. He'd had a long telephone conversation with Vince earlier in the day and was absolutely stunned when Vince told him that he'd changed his mind. He wasn't going to air the Rockers winning the belts, the Hart Foundation would keep them, for now. To Jim it was a stay of execution, but my heart sank. What was to come of my push, the real push, the one that Vince just promised me? I never thought I'd see the day that I'd be disappointed to find out that I was keeping a belt. I'd made the mistake of getting my hopes up. Calgary was quilted by an early winter. Under the blanket of white lurked a darkness that made its way up snowy steps and into Hart House. My mom sat riveted to the TV in the kitchen, concerned about the tension in the Persian Gulf. Living for 4 decades in Canada hadn't muted her American patriotism any more than her New York accent. While America was preparing to kick the hell out of the mother of all evils, Allison's 4-year-old daughter, Brooke, raced into the kitchen and came to a screeching halt in front of my mom. "Grammy, Dean's dead." "That's not funny, Brooke." But upstairs in the boys' bathroom, Smith and Georgia knelt beside Dean's naked body. Smith cried as he ran his fingers through Dean's hair, kissing him on the forehead and pleading in desperation, "No, Biz, don't die." One look from Stu told my mom all she needed to know. Dean had ignored his doctors one time too many. Only the night before the hospital called again, and Stu told Dean he would take him for a dialysis treatment first thing in the morning. Stu had woken him, but when Dean went to wash up he keeled over. Dean Harry Hart, dead at 34. At that moment, I was with Bruce and Jim in Providence, Rhode Island. It was the day before the Survivor Series, and I'd arranged for Bruce to meet with Vince. All of us were called into a small office in the back of the Civic Center, where Chief handed me the phone. "It's your pop." Stu came on the line. "I hate to have to tell you this, our Dean Harry has expired. He's no longer with us. He succumbed late this morning." Some sour-faced old fart was yelling at me to get the hell out of his office and off his damn phone. I put my hand over the receiver to tell him that there was a family emergency, that my brother had died, but he wasn't listening. So I raised my voice and told him again, only this time I added that he better get out before I threw him out. After the show in Providence, Bruce, Jim and I drove down to Hartford, Connecticut. Being the old-school wrestling promoter that he was, Stu told me to finish my bookings. There was nothing that could be done for Dean anymore. I would have gone home anyway, but I could tell by the look in Bruce's eyes that he didn't want to face it yet, so I kept on, trying to keep a handle on my grief. The following day was American Thanksgiving, and at the Hartford Civic Center wrestlers gorged on a catered turkey dinner. Survivor Series was only hours away. Bruce and I mostly kept to ourselves, telling each other stories about Dean. Word of our brother's passing spread among the wrestlers, and dozens of them paid their respects. On our way to the lunchroom, Bruce and I had run into Vince and Pat coming out of an elevator. They were in a great mood, and Pat gave me a crisp slap on the back. "Cheer up, you look like someone died, for Christ's sakes." I managed to calmly say, "Yeah, Pat, our brother Dean passed away." Neither he nor Vince seemed to take the news on board and walked cheerily away, annoying yuck-yuck laughs reverberating down the hall in their wake. Bruce had expected a warm welcome from Vince. Now doubt and rejection added to the sadness on his face. "Don't worry, Bruce," I tried to reassure him, "they're just busy, and it must be that they don't know." In contrast, neither of us will ever forget the kindness of Kerry Von Erich, who smiled and said, "Don't worry, he's up there right now with my 3 brothers. They'll look after him." I didn't know whether I could even work, but the memories of how Dean loved my matches and of our good times together growing up inspired me. I wanted to dedicate the match to his memory. It was bizarre to meet Vince's new gimmick. A towering red-haired kid from Houston named Mark Calloway, his Huck Finn features hidden by the dark circles painted under his eyes to give him the look of a cadaver. He was the Undertaker dressed all in black, complete with a wide-brimmed hat. Pat explained to all of us that Vince wanted him over super strong, didn't want him even leaving his feet. How odd that, today of all days, my job was to battle death in a strange kind of morality play. Once the Undertaker was eliminated by disqualification, I was to be the last man standing against the $1 Million Man. As fate would have it, I was the first WWF wrestler to ever lock up with The Undertaker. Little did I know that, much farther down the road, he would wind up being the last wrestler to work with me in the WWF. Once Taker was eliminated, the stage would be set for me and Ted DiBiase to steal the show. Losing can be a beautiful thing if it's done right. The Hitman character was generally seen as a wrestler who, try as he might, could never quite win. This made him more human than, say, Warrior or Hogan. His constant struggle to make it to the top was endearing to the fans because it was something they could identify with in their own lives. In his live commentary, Roddy told the world that I was dedicating this match to my brother Dean, who had died the day before, knowing it would sink into the hearts of wrestling fans everywhere. The only fans who didn't know were the ones in the building. We had a beautiful up and down exchange full of near finishes. As I slid in behind Ted with a quick crotch roll, the crowd counted along with the referee, 1, 2, but Ted, the old pro, kicked out yet again. I could feel Dean's presence next to me, smiling. I pushed off Ted and headed over to the corner, perching myself on the middle rope. Suddenly, in my mind, I was alone. No Ted, no crowd. I'm a kid back at the pavilion, outside on the grass, standing over Dean. He has Curly Clark, a big, freckle face, red-haired program seller, clamped in a full Nelson. They're both sweaty and panting with their shirts off, and then Curly finally taps out and Dean, the smallest of the Hart kids, springs to his feet with big eyes and a handsome smile. My hero. Then I snapped back to the Hartford Civic Center and the sold-out Survivor Series, and I was about to launch myself off the ropes at Ted, thinking, "This is for you, Dean. I know it isn't much, but it's all I got." It was time for me to slip and fall on a banana peel, breaking the hearts of the fans, who wanted me to win this one for my brother. I dove across Ted, but as we fell to the mat he rolled through, cradling me, his fingers tightly locked. There was no escape. I kicked out just a hair too late. My eyes were cold, wet and hurt. I hope Dean enjoyed it. For me, the emotion was always real, especially the heartbreak. The camera captured my sorrow for all the hearts watching on TV back home, where my intentions were understood. When I returned to the dressing room, Ted embraced me, sweat and tears indistinguishable. As expected, the rest of the pay-per-view was centered on Warrior and Hogan. I hung around backstage taking in their silent competition for that elusive top spot, but I think wrestling fans were beginning to see them both for what they really were, two colossal steroid freaks who did little or no actual wrestling. If you watched either one of them wrestle once, you'd seen all that they had. I was hoping that Vince would take a moment with Bruce, but the more we hung around, the more it bothered me that neither Vince nor Pat even offered their condolences. Once the show ended, Bruce, Jim and I simply went back to our hotel. November 27, 1990. A miserable, viciously cold day in Calgary. The Hearts gathered around the dining room table. It seemed only fitting that we tell some stories about Dean and all the characters he'd charmed and conned over the years, and it wasn't long before we were all smiling. Tammy put on a brave face holding her and Dean's daughter, hoping that with the help of Stu and Helen she'd survive all this. Finally, the Hart clan, minus the grandkids, bundled up against the 20 below weather and piled into various cars to drive to a small parcel of Stu's land 2 minutes down the hill from Hart House. In brutal wind and snow, we shivered through our last words before scattering Dean's ashes. The tears froze on our cheeks. Back at Hart House, we listened to a cassette tape Owen had sent from Germany on which he talked passionately about Dean and how much he wished he could be there with us. There were those in the family who felt that my parents should have had a more elaborate funeral for Dean. Personally, I loved the honest simplicity of it, and I think Dean would have liked it just the way it was. On January 16, 1991, fighting began in the Persian Gulf. 3 days later, at the Royal Rumble, Slaughter dethroned Warrior for the WWF World title. The angle felt eerie to most of us in the dressing room. Some of us debated whether wrestling was too much of a cartoon to make light of something as serious as war, especially one where the US was bracing for a high body count. Yet, most of the wrestlers had faith in Vince, since he'd always had an uncanny sense of giving the public just what they wanted, and his gambles always seemed to pay off. And Vince had a vision of more than 100,000 fans coming out to WrestleMania 7 at the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum to watch the WWF's real American hero, Hulk Hogan, give that traitor Slaughter what he had coming. The WWF even asked Slaughter to burn the American flag, but he flat out refused. He had enough heat as it was. He had received death threats, and there were bomb scares at the buildings he worked in. The Royal Rumble did nothing for me, Jim, or Davey Boy, who was waiting in the wings for his own supposed big push. He was now calling himself the British Bulldog and really looked the part, being bigger than ever. He wore long, Braided hair extensions beaded in the colors of the Union Jack that also adorned his impressive sequin cape. At the TVs in Macon, Georgia, on January 28, Jim and I were once again summoned to see Vince. He told us we'd be dropping the tag straps at WrestleMania 7 to the Nasty Boys, two school chums from Allentown, Pennsylvania. Brian Knobbs was a loud, lovable 300-pound kid with a blonde mohawk. Jerry Saggs was also a slab of a man with a black mohawk and one tooth missing up front. They took the numerous complaints from the boys about their stiff, sloppy work good-naturedly, as a bit of harmless teasing. The truth was they were as wild as two Brahma bulls in a china shop, and most of the boys loved them because they were true to the spirit of wrestling's notorious wild men of the past. They reminded me a lot of Adrian Adonis. Once we'd dropped the belts, I figured it was time for that singles push Vince owed me. Curt Hennig had taken the Intercontinental belt from Kerry Von Erich, whom Vince pulled the plug on pretty fast, and there was now a buzz about me and Curt working a program. Curt was the best heel in the company, maybe even in the business, at that time, and I knew he'd be keeping the belt for a while, especially since Hogan would obviously be winning the world title from Slaughter at WrestleMania 7. The IC belt would need to stay on a heel to balance out the cards. My instinct told me to wait. It was the guy who worked with Curt after his next opponent who was a more likely bet to get the belt. I have to outwork everyone, even Vince, and I knew I could. On March 12 at Biloxi TVs, the Foundation was to take on the Legion of Doom for a home video. Even though we were still the champions, we were supposed to put them over, as the video would come out after WrestleMania 7. I didn't care. I'd come to like and respect the team who were once the Road Warriors, and this would be our one and only chance to work with them. Joe Laurinaitis, or Animal, had a wide mohawk and was a thick powerhouse. His partner, Mike Hegstrand, or Hawk, was a big, loud raspy-voiced character with a long, sinewy torso. I always thought the best actual wrestlers of our generation came out of Minneapolis. Guys like LOD, Rude, Hennig, Warlord and Darsow had all grown up watching the AWA's greatest workers like Bockwinkel, Ray Stevens, Mad Dog Vachon, even the Brit tough guy and shooter Billy Robinson, all of whom had a more credible style than most American wrestlers. About an hour before our match, Hawk tilted his head back and plopped 3 or 4 placidals in his mouth as if he was trying to impress me and Jim. By the time we made our way to the ring, Hawk was half asleep on rubber legs. Needless to say, what should have been an all-time classic turned into a bore as Animal, Jim, and I did all we could not to expose to Vince or the agents that Hawk was nearly comatose. I liked Hawk, but I was disappointed that he ruined something that meant a lot to the rest of us. After the Gulf War ended, Vince decided to move WrestleMania 7 from the LA Coliseum to the LA Sports Memorial Arena. The rumor was that Slaughter had so much heat that there was fear of a bomb threat, but many of us in the dressing room thought it was because ticket sales were slow. With the war over, the Slaughter angle was quickly losing steam. Kerry Von Erich opened the show by defeating Dino Bravo. Upon his victory, Kerry came up grinning and shooting his fingers like 6 guns in what would turn out to be an eerie prefiguring of events yet to come for both of them. Hogan looked tanned and muscled and was decked out in an American flag bandana. Randy Savage looked more like a lime green psychedelic space cowboy as he worked on his match with Warrior. Davey Boy beat his close friend Warlord in only 4 minutes. The look on Warlord's face told me he was just starting to realize that he'd been given a thumbs down for a serious push. Jim and I went on early in what was really a call to go out and kick the show into high gear. The Nasty Boys headed out with Jimmy Hart, who was wearing a spray-painted motorcycle helmet as protection from us. Our music played and off we went, the pink tassels on our epaulets swinging as we high-fived fans on our way to the ring. I pulled open my jacket to expose the shiny gold belt that had meant so much to me once upon a time. But now I was galloping beyond that. Beware the dark horse. We ended a terrific match with some classic foundation. With the ref pushing me back into my corner, we turned our backs long enough for Jimmy to toss the half-dead Saggs his crash helmet, which Saggs then smashed beautifully over Anvil's head. Then he pulled an equally blown-up Knobbs across Anvil's chest as he rolled under the bottom rope. By the time I stepped out on the apron, the ref was diving down for the count. 1, 2, see ya, Jim. Exhausted, I stood at the back curtain watching Warrior summon some mystical power to beat Macho Man, with the help of his new heel valet, Scary Sherry Martel. But up in the crowd, tiny Miss Elizabeth left her seat, climbed into the ring and with superhuman strength hurled the robust Sherry over the top rope. Then she made up with Randy in the middle of the ring to a huge pop. Miss Elizabeth was truly a flower among the weeds. As for Hogan and Slaughter, from where I stood they looked like 2 elephants tussling over a water hole. Slaughter barely tapped Hogan on the head with a steel folding chair, and Hogan bladed himself, but even with the blood the match was a hooky affair. with Hogan wagging his finger in Slaughter's face before the big boot and the leg drop. Same old story. Vince knew he needed a new one and he wasn't going to find it in Warrior or Hogan. The day after WrestleMania 7 was Julie's birthday. We sat in a rented convertible looking out over Red Rock Canyon, just outside Las Vegas, sipping wine coolers in the warm breeze. The thousands of giant red boulders reminded me of a Road Runner cartoon. We were relieved to have found some peace and quiet after 6 days in LA running around with so many hearts and a teething blade. The night before he'd slept between us as we quietly whispered back and forth so as not to wake him. Then Blade sat up looking cranky, slapped me on the hand and then brought his fat little hand down right on Julie's forehead, as if to say, "You too, keep it down, I'm trying to sleep." He rolled over and fell back asleep instantly. I laughed so hard I had to get up and leave the room. I told Julie I thought that if I could have a good run for 3 years I could make enough money to pay off the house and come home for good. I loved Julie, but somehow I had turned into this wrestler. On good days, she still saw me as her hero, but she was long past tired of having to share me with the wrestling business. The next day at Vegas TV's, Pat asked me if I knew how to put on a scorpion death lock. I told him no, but that I could figure it out. So I went in search of a wrestler who could show me. The only one who knew was a Mexican named Conan. As I lay on my back he held the heels of my boots in his hands, threaded his leg between mine, stepped over me while crossing my legs and jammed one of my feet under his armpit, all while twisting me over like a Boston crab. This move looked great but was a total work in that it was damn near impossible to put on somebody unless he let you, or he was out cold. After my match, as I looked out at the crowd, there were pink and black signs everywhere. The Hart Foundation music, "Now Mine Alone," thumped loudly as I strutted past the gorilla position, the long table where Gorilla Monsoon sat wearing a headset sending the matches out. I passed by Vince, who looked more than impressed by my crowd reaction. I took a chance and asked, "So are you gonna give it to me or not?" He grinned playfully and said, "Yeah, I'm gonna give it to you." The next day, in Reno, Pat handed me an interview sheet requiring me to do interviews for upcoming matches with Kurt. I told him I'd pass unless they were planning to put the IC belt on me. Minutes later, in Vince's office, I counted on my fingers how many times he'd failed to come through with his promises. By the time I got to the 8th finger, Vince cut me off, chuckling, "Forget all about it. It's ancient history. Think about the future, Brett." I looked him in the eye and told him that history repeats itself over and over. We both laughed like I was kidding, but I wasn't. Pat came in and interrupted us to tell me I had to come up with a name for my new finishing move. Between the three of us we tossed around different ideas until finally I threw out executioner, eliminator, sniper, sharpshooter, that's it. Vince cut me off smiling. "I like that. Sharpshooter." I saw a glimmer in his eyes that told me if his head were made of glass I'd see all kinds of gears whirring around in it. The next day Julie came with me on a tour to Japan. I was happy to see a familiar, smiling face waiting for us in the lobby of the hotel in Tokyo. Ito, bow-legged as ever, had moved back to Japan a few years earlier after finishing up his career in Calgary. He was now oddly content running a profitable noodle shop left to him by his late sister. He kindly took Julie and me out for dinner and drinks, and we talked about old times. Hito spoke well of Owen and regarded Stu like he would a father. The next day the WWF had me booked to reunite with Jim for one more tag team match in the Tokyo Egg Dome. There was no pressure on me whatsoever because I knew it would be nothing but easy working with the Rockers. Unfortunately, once we got out there, the serious Japanese fans didn't buy the phony rehearsed high spots. Just because there were 60-something thousand of them didn't mean that they weren't the same deadpan Japanese fans. We took it up a notch, and it felt good hearing both Snuka and Valentine say afterwards that it was the best tag match they'd ever seen. The main event pitted Hogan and a Japanese star named Tenryu against the Legion of Doom in a blood-filled orgy of gore that made no real sense, but at last got a reaction out of the lifeless crowd. Most of the wrestlers were set to fly home the next day except for me, Earthquake and Hogan. We would take an early train to Osaka for one more show in Kobe. So after the show that night, Julie and I hit the heart of the Roppongi district, eventually winding up at the Hard Rock Cafe, where various wrestlers fraternized with Madonna's road crew and with chain-smoking ring rats, who'd only sprung up in Japan in recent years. Julie had formed so many thoughts about Japan from what I'd told her about my previous trips she was thrilled to finally see it for herself. LA, Vegas and Japan all in one trip was a far cry from being at home in the kitchen with the kids. After my match in Kobe, an anxious Earthquake asked my advice on what he should do about being openly challenged by the equally massive Koji Kiao, a sumo sensation now trying to make a name for himself as a pro wrestler. Quake was Big John Tenta, 400-pound mountain of a man who shook the ground when he walked and hailed from Surrey, BC. He had been the Canadian amateur super heavyweight champion, and had enjoyed short-lived notoriety in Japan in earlier days as a white sumo wrestler, where he was undefeated. I really didn't know what to tell him. Quake sat there simmering and aggravated, concerned about what he might do if Kiao got him mad enough. His only real worry was that someone might jump in on their match. When Hogan and I both assured him that we'd watch his back, it seemed to calm him considerably. The two big men circled each other furiously, like Rodan and Godzilla, huffing and puffing, sometimes drawing close enough to take swipes at each other. The spectators' faces wore perfectly frozen looks of horror like you'd see in those old Japanese monster movies. The only thing missing was the shrieking sound effects. Finally, Kiao put his tail between his legs and backed down to catcalls from the crowd, then slunk back to his dressing room, knocking and smashing things as he went. I felt like announcing over the PA, "Rodan is dead. You people can go back to your homes." Quake came back grinning from ear to ear. Hogan and I patted him on the back. "You showed him." I beamed. I always thought it was a funny little fight, especially since they never once touched each other. While Hogan got ready for his match, he asked me what Vince was doing with me. I considered Terry a friend, so I told him where I stood. I was surprised to hear him say, with a hurt look on his face, that Vince was trying to bring him down. His WWF deal was up soon, and he told me that Ted Turner's WCW was interested in him. It was easy for me to see that Terry liked his ovation that night because it showed Vince that Hogan could always go back to Japan, that maybe the WWF needed Hulk Hogan more than he needed them. But, as he confided to me, Terry really didn't want to go anywhere. Vince had one more jerk around in store for me. In May he announced that he'd changed his mind and was putting me back with Jim. 3 weeks later, after much worry on my part, I was summoned to see Vince at the Sacramento TVs, where he did another about-face. I'd be taking the Intercontinental belt from Kurt at SummerSlam at Madison Square Garden, just like I'd figured out back in April. I remember the day in 1979 when Hito told me Vince McMahon said I didn't have a big enough name to wrestle in Madison Square Garden. As I left Vince's office, I felt a deep sense of pride and accomplishment. The Intercontinental belt was the first step in my far-off dream of being the WWF World Champion. Steroids were about to give the WWF a different sort of jab in the ass. On June 27, Dr. George T. Zahor Ian III was convicted by a jury in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, of 4 counts of distributing anabolic steroids to a bodybuilder who was working as an undercover informant for the FBI, 4 counts of distributing large quantities of Schedule III and 4 controlled substances to the same informant, 4 counts of distributing anabolic steroids to 4 professional wrestlers between November 1988 and March 1990, and 2 counts of using his office condominium, valued at $3.7 million, to facilitate the distribution of controlled substances. The condo was immediately seized by the U.S. government. Zahor Ian maintained throughout his trial that as a physician to various wrestlers he'd done nothing wrong by providing steroids, which he said were necessary considering the physical demands inherent in pro wrestling. His lawyer argued that as a physician Zahor Ian should be allowed to provide steroids for performance enhancement, and Zahor Ian testified that he was unaware of a law that had gone into effect in November 1988, banning the sale of steroids for anything other than the treatment of disease. Zahor Ian was set to be sentenced in about 2 months. He faced a maximum of 44 years in prison and $3 million in fines. During the Zahor Ian case, investigators found FedEx waybills that linked shipments from Zahor Ian directly to the homes of several wrestlers, including Hogan, as well as to Vince at his new monolithic office building in Stamford, Connecticut. During the trial, Zahor Ian described Hogan as already having a serious steroid abuse problem when the two first met in 1984, and he admitted to dispensing steroids to 15 to 20 wrestlers at an average TV taping. What had started the feds looking at Zahor Ian in the first place, and whether they had been after Zahor Ian himself or had simply used him as a stepping stone to try to get to McMahon, no one knew. The fact is that prior to the Zahor Ian indictment, superstar Billy Graham and Bruno Sammartino had made negative comments about the WWF to the media and the feds, claiming that 95% of WWF wrestlers were abusing steroids. Zahor Ian's testimony confirmed that. Graham had become severely crippled in recent years, and he blamed it on steroid abuse, painting himself as an unfortunate guinea pig from a time when the dangers of steroids were not known. He said he was speaking out to save a new generation of wrestlers from ending up in a wheelchair like he did. The media circled the scandal like sharks in a feeding frenzy. As soon as Zahor Ian was found guilty, Vince called a meeting to let his wrestlers know that starting in just a few weeks he would voluntarily implement a drug testing policy even stricter than the one used for Olympic athletes. Everyone had to get off the juice. He made it clear that this time it would be impossible to cheat because there would be two people watching you piss in a cup. In June 1991, I had started writing a weekly column for the Calgary Sun about the wrestling life, and the first one also promoted the WWF card for the upcoming Stampede Week. TVs were going to be in Calgary and Edmonton during the 1991 Calgary Stampede. I expected Vince would figure that Calgary was the perfect place to start making me a star. I couldn't help but ask myself what I would do if Vince really did come through with my big push and I didn't make it. What if my self-perceptions were wrong and I didn't get over like I always believed I would? Although I thought I was over, I didn't really know, and I'd be heartbroken if I found out otherwise right there in my hometown of Calgary. Pulling up to the Saddledome, I could see the pavilion and was flooded with memories, but Stampede Wrestling was no more. Foley was dead. Schultz and Dynamite were finished for good. Bad news, thank God, had been put out to pasture like a mean old bull. Bruce and Jim were still holding on to faint hope. The only two Stampede boys still really running were Davey and me. That night as I walked out to my music, I was blown away by the thundering response. It touched me in a way that said, "You hang in there, Bret Hart. You show him you're the best." After the tapings, Stu and Helen invited Vince and all the boys to Hart House for homemade corned beef sandwiches and beer. Davey Boy asked the Nasty Boys to stay over at Stu's house, intentionally misleading Sags, who was severely allergic to cats, by telling him that Stu had got rid of them all. Sags soon started sneezing and broke into a rash and was forced to flee. Vince arrived with Pat, Howard Finkel, Terry Garvin and a black ring announcer named Mel Phillips. Mel was something of a whipping boy for all of them, and before long Vince and Pat were doing everything they could to get Stu to stretch him in the dungeon. Stu thought they only wanted to make fun of Mel, and at first he wouldn't go for it. A couple of months earlier, on a bus ride somewhere in Europe, Mike Tomei, a rookie referee, made the mistake of confiding to Jacques Rougeau that one night when he shared a room with Mel Phillips, he was awakened by Mel straddling him buck naked at the foot of his bed and sucking hard on his big toe. "Then what happened?" Jacques asked. Mike said, "I told him I didn't like it and to stop, and he did." Between fits of laughter, Jacques told everybody on the bus. Of course, none of us could stop laughing either. When we got back to the States, I had little choice but to immortalize the incident on the blackboard, adding Mel to the long-standing, ever-changing orgy with Princess Toma in chief. Mike in hand and still wearing his announcing tuxedo, Mel Phillips hung by his lips from Chief's big toe. This was a big hit with the boys, so I drew it everywhere for a while. After an hour of prodding from Vince and Pat, Stu was finally persuaded to get his hooks on Mel. From the kitchen, we could hear sharp screams followed by giddy laughter and grunting coming from downstairs. I hurried down to find Mel stripped down to his undershirt, slacks and socks, and inquired whether he wanted Stu to show him how to put on a flying toe hold. Neither Vince nor Pat wanted to get too close. Stu stretching either one of them would have been a beautiful thing to watch, and they knew it. Stu let Mel off easily enough, climbing off him like a forgiving spider. It turned out to be a wonderful evening for everyone, except maybe for Mel Phillips. By mid-July, the latest WWF crisis was an interview that Hogan did on the Arsenio Hall show in which he flat out lied and looked bad doing it. I was embarrassed hearing him say he'd never taken steroids, except once for an injury. If he'd been honest, it's likely we'd never have heard another word about it. But now the media was all over Hogan, calling him a hypocrite because he had always preached to kids that they could be like him by saying their prayers and taking their vitamins. Reminiscent of Tricky Dick Nixon, Hogan would find out that it's the lie that'll bring you down. A few days after the interview, Hogan told me that Vince had given him direct orders that he was never to admit to taking steroids, so he had no choice but to lie. I never bought that. Nobody should be able to make you lie about something so obvious. If it's true that Vince told him to lie, it shows the extent of Vince's influence. When I thought about myself and steroids, it occurred to me that all the commotion might actually benefit me. Compared to the rest of them, I was relatively clean. On August 10th in Des Moines, I posed for pictures with the Intercontinental Belt, which I hadn't even won yet, for the cover of the November issue of the WWF's monthly magazine. I'd never known Vince to cancel a magazine cover yet, so it was a great sign that nothing was going wrong this time. That same day, Vince called all the wrestlers to a meeting where he introduced Dr. Mauro Pasquale, a world-renowned expert on drug testing. Vince was caught off guard to find that most of the wrestlers were vehemently opposed to the drug testing. He didn't seem to realize that a lot of the guys were physically addicted to steroids. When the angry wrestlers called him on whether the bodybuilders in his fledgling World Bodybuilding Federation would be tested, men who had guaranteed contracts and medical benefits that the wrestlers still didn't have, paid for with revenue generated by the wrestlers, Vince swore that in his bodybuilding federation no one would be on steroids. It seemed ridiculous to me that Vince thought clean bodybuilders could compete with steroid freaks. At the meeting, the wrestlers were told that they would have 6 weeks to wean themselves, and that then Dr. Pasquale would ensure that every wrestler in the WWF had acceptable testosterone levels. If you failed a test, it would be 3 strikes and you're out. It was tough for many of the steroid freaks to decide what was more important, their jobs or their roids. My matches with Curt Hennig remind me of those Spy vs. Spy cartoons in Mad Magazine. We were comparable in age, size and background, and we had a similar look, except that Kurt's mane was long, blonde and curly. Both of us were second-generation wrestlers whose fathers were respected men in a tough business. We shared an understanding of what it was like to fill their shoes. But until I saw Curt in the locker room before the show August 26, 1991, at Madison Square Garden, I'd been anxious. The rumor was that he wouldn't show because his back was too messed up. In fact, his injury was bad enough that he'd been forced to do nothing all summer long but fish. Aware that this match could end up being Kurt's last one, I wanted to give him the best send-off I could. He told me he'd been unable to do much to get ready and he trusted me to take care of him out there. It was a big night for me, with Stu, Helen, Bruce, Julie and my kids in the audience. Curt had put on a little weight from not working for over 2 months and his back was tight. Often during the match he winced from jarring spasms. I made myself as humanly light as possible to help Curt, who gave all he had. I could actually see my mom and dad looking on from the front row. If there was ever chemistry between 2 wrestlers, there was none better than that between me and Curt, who insisted that night that I kick out of his finish. The perfect plex. Something he had never done for anyone else. Going into the finish, when I was on the mat selling, Perfect pulled me to the middle of the ring, parted my legs and dropped his leg across my groin. Then he rolled backwards smartly to his feet, parted my legs and went for it again, but as his leg dropped across my stomach I wrapped it with mine, hooking him into the sharpshooter from my back. I twisted to my stomach and pushed myself up to a standing position with the crowd right behind me thunderously chanting, "Let's go, Brett." Before I could even hold the pose long enough for Perfect to submit properly, Eckner rang the bell. In the aftermath it was Kurt's idea that I should rip his blue singlet off and wear it over my shoulder like a battle trophy. I kissed the Intercontinental belt before I held it up over my head and paraded to all 4 corners, standing on the second rope bullhorning the crowd with my fingers, something I'd do for the rest of my career. When I left the ring I took the short steps up to shake Stu's hand and hug my mom, with the cameras following me. I'd never seen my mom this happy. It was as though she'd finally made peace with the darn wrestling business, after all these years. Stu looked so proud. Here he was, 45 years later, back at MSG, that good-looking kid from Edmonton with the virgin ears and his cute little girlfriend from Long Beach. He grinned and clapped, nudging my mom to join in, but she couldn't have been clapping any harder. The only sour note for me was that Julie missed the match because she'd gone shopping. By the time I got to the hotel, she was inexplicably in a bad mood. As had become a pattern at every pay-per-view I ever brought her to, we launched into an ugly, heated quarrel, for reasons I've never understood. I ended up celebrating the biggest moment of my career so far at the Hard Rock Cafe with Jade, Dallas, and Bruce, who sat picking at his burger as though somebody had hit him over the head with a sledgehammer. He was deeply worried because back at home Andrea had been rushed to the hospital in premature labor. Every time I brought Bruce down, something went wrong, and I felt horrible for him. I flew home from the SummerSlam with Julie and the kids and found out when we arrived that Andrea had given birth to a baby boy who they named Rhett. He was so sickly that it didn't look like he was going to pull through. The whole Hart family became gravely consumed with little Rhett fighting for his life,